Before we delve into this macabre story of the Whitmore Mansion, I want to know from you, where are you watching us from today? Write in the comments. It's always amazing to see how different parts of the world follow our stories. And if you're not yet subscribed, click the button, sign up and turn on notifications so you don't miss any horror, mystery and suspense stories. Here, each video features real mysteries and situations that defy logic, and you'll want to stay up to date. The grey stone walls rose above the road like a silent warning. Too tall to be merely decorative, too thick to seem symbolic, they had surrounded the Whitmore family property for over a century. In that remote part of Massachusetts, houses typically featured white picket fences, open gardens, and inviting porches. The Whitmore's house was different. It always had been. Jonathan Whitmore parked his car in front of the wrought iron gate, turned off the engine, and remained motionless for a few seconds. The silence around him was unnatural. There were no insects, birds, or perceptible wind among the ancient trees that lined the gravel path. The place seemed suspended in time, as if waiting for something or someone. He was returning home after a 15-year absence. Jonathan wore a dark overcoat unsuitable for early autumn, but necessary to hide the slight trembling in his hands. It wasn't cold. It never had been. It was something else. Something he'd known since childhood, even without ever putting it into words. An old discomfort, ingrained in his memory like a smell that won't dissipate. On the other side of the walls, the mansion remained untouched. 3 stories of late colonial architecture, tall, symmetrical windows, all closed. No lights on. No sign of life. Yet Jonathan had a distinct feeling of being watched. The antagonism of that place wasn't manifested in ruins or decay, but in excessive order. Everything was in its place, clean, preserved, as if the house refused to age along with the world. The Whitmore family had always been synonymous with respect and influence. Bankers, investors, generous donors to hospitals and universities. In public, they were examples of tradition, discipline, and success. In private, however, little was known. Employees rarely stayed long, drivers quit without explanation, gardeners disappeared from the routine without even collecting their last paycheck. These facts never made it to the newspapers. Jonathan grew up there, but not as a proud heir. He grew up as someone who learned early on not to ask questions. His father, Edward Whitmore, ruled the house with quiet authority. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply observed. And his mere presence was enough for everyone to adjust themselves, correct their posture, and lower their voices. His mother, Margaret, existed like an elegant shadow, always well-dressed, always distant. Her eyes rarely met Jonathan's for more than a few seconds. When they did, there was something about them that the boy didn't understand, but which made him instinctively turn away. That night, upon returning, Jonathan walked through the gate after manually entering the code. The old system recognized the code flawlessly. The house somehow still accepted it. The tires crunched softly on the gravel as he sped along the winding road to the main entrance. The facade loomed imposingly, with wide columns supporting the porch and a dark, solid wood door, marked by carvings that Jonathan avoided looking at for long. As a child, he used to think those carved figures shifted position when no one was looking. He got out of the car, closed the door with excessive care, and took a deep breath. The air felt heavier there, as if it required conscious effort to inhale. As he climbed the steps, he noticed something that shouldn't be there. Recent mud stains on the white marble of the balcony. Someone had passed by there. Jonathan frowned, but didn't back down. He turned the key in the old lock and pushed the door open. The interior of the mansion greeted him with a familiar scent of waxed wood and something metallic, almost imperceptible. The main hall remained exactly as he remembered it. The grandfather clock still kept time, although it was stopped at a specific hour, 3:17 a.m., always at 3:17 a.m. Jonathan put his suitcase down and took a few steps forward. The floor creaked beneath his feet, betraying his every movement. The house reacted to his presence, not in a hostile way, but attentively, as if it were assessing whether his return was legitimate. He hadn't come out of homesickness, nor because of inheritance, although officially that was the reason. Jonathan had returned because, days before, he had received a letter with no return address, containing only one handwritten sentence: "You never really left." As he watched the hallway leading to the inner wings of the house, Jonathan noticed that some doors were ajar, something that never happened when his father was still alive. Edward Whitmore kept everything closed, controlled, sealed. Order had been broken, and this, more than any memory, indicated that something was wrong. Whitmore Manor was not only large, it was organized in a way that imposed discipline. Each corridor led to another, with almost mathematical precision, as if the space had been planned not for comfort, but for control. Jonathan advanced slowly, passing through the main living room, where dark leather sofas remained untouched, covered by a thin layer of dust, too uniform to be natural. No one had sat there for some time, but someone was cleaning. The walls displayed portraits of ancestors who observed the surroundings with stern expressions. No smiles, no gestures of affection, only rigid faces, dressed in clothes from different eras, all sharing the same assessing gaze. Jonathan felt an old discomfort return, as if he were once again being judged simply for existing. In that house, everything had unspoken rules. Children didn't run, doors weren't slammed, questions weren't asked unnecessarily. Jonathan had learned this early on, observing more than listening. Silence had always been the dominant language. As he crossed the old dining room, he noticed that the long oak table was still set. Plates lined up, silverware polished, bowls perfectly arranged, as if a formal dinner were about to take place. No food, no lit candles, just the pretense of normalcy. It didn't make sense. The house should have been empty since his father's death, which had occurred months before under circumstances far too discreet for someone of that importance. Edward Whitmore was buried quickly. No public ceremony, no official statement beyond a short note in the financial records. To the world, he had simply ceased to exist. Jonathan climbed the central staircase, where the smooth wooden handrail bore almost invisible marks, worn by hands that had ascended and descended countless times. Upon reaching the second floor, he heard a brief sound. Not a footstep, but something more subtle, like the displacement of air caused by a door closing in the distance. He stopped. The house didn't respond with absolute silence. There were internal creaks, the distant ticking of a stopped clock, the discreet creaking of wood, adjusting itself. Common, rational sounds. Even so, Jonathan was certain he wasn't alone. The room that had been his in childhood remained untouched. The bed was made with excessive precision, the books lined up on the shelf, exactly as they had been left 15 years before. No sign of neglect, not a single cobweb. It was as if time had been frozen in that specific space, preserved not out of affection, but out of necessity. Jonathan touched the surface of the desk and quickly withdrew his finger when he felt the varnish was still fresh. Someone had been there recently. Memories surfaced in fragments. Not complete scenes, but sensations. The weight of being watched while doing homework, the constant presence of his father behind him, without saying a word, the feeling of making mistakes even when everything seemed correct. Edward never praised, he only corrected. And when there was no correction, there was silence, the heaviest kind of disapproval. Margaret Whitmore was different, but not more approachable. She appeared at specific moments, always to reinforce already established rules. She never contradicted her husband. She never protected her son. Her role seemed to be to maintain the appearance of balance, while something profoundly dysfunctional remained hidden. Jonathan closed the bedroom door and walked down the hall to the west wing, an area of the house that had always been avoided. Officially, it was just archive rooms and old family offices. In practice, no one entered there without Edward's direct permission. Now, one of the doors was open, The interior revealed tall shelves crammed with boxes labeled with dates and codes. There were no names, only numbers. Jonathan approached one of them and noticed that some were marked with discreet, almost imperceptible symbols engraved by hand. They didn't look like ordinary financial records. At the far end of the room, a smaller desk held a black-covered notebook. Jonathan opened it and found recent notes. The handwriting was firm, precise, the same as his father's, but that was impossible. Edward was dead. The notes weren't reflective or personal. They were observations, records of behavior, schedules, emotional reactions described with clinical coldness. Some names were crossed out, others circled. And on one of the pages, Jonathan found something that made his stomach clench. Your own name. The house wasn't just a preserved home. It was a system that continued to function even without its creator visible. And Jonathan was beginning to understand that his return wasn't a coincidence. It was part of something that had never truly ended. Jonathan closed the notebook with excessive care, as if a sudden movement might awaken something asleep. The silence that followed seemed thicker, compressing the air around him. He tucked the object into his overcoat and left the file room without turning off the light. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was a test. As he walked away down the hallway, he had the impression that the light behind him diminished, as if the house were correcting the error on its own. On the ground floor, he found the back door unlocked. The old service exit, used by employees who rarely stayed. Outside, the inner garden stretched out in precise geometric lines, shrubs pruned with millimetric precision, stone paths recently washed, fountains without leaves or debris. Maintenance continued. Someone was taking care of it, but there were no cars, noises, or obvious signs of human presence. Jonathan walked through the garden and noticed recent footprints near the old shed. They weren't large nor deep. They seemed measured, calculated. Pushing open the shed door, he found tools organized by size and function, all clean. On a workbench were new gloves, still in their packaging. He didn't touch them. A metallic sound echoed from inside the house. Jonathan returned quickly, his heart racing not from irrational fear, but from the practical realization that there was movement. In the main hall, the door to the west wing, which he remembered having closed, was once again ajar. The house was not only reacting, it was anticipating. He climbed the stairs with firm steps, aware that the confrontation could no longer be avoided. On the second floor, the pendulum clock emitted a single dry click, though it remained stopped at 3:17. Jonathan walked to his father's old office, a room that had always been locked during his childhood. Now, the door was open. The office retained the same metallic smell as the hall, even more intense there. The walls were lined with shelves of technical books, bound reports, and folders labeled with dates stretching back decades. In the center, Edward's desk remained untouched. On it, a white envelope, too clean for that old setting. Jonathan opened the envelope. Inside, he found recent photographs of the mansion itself. Exterior angles, specific windows, interior corridors. Some images showed Jonathan entering the house, captured from high points, impossible for ordinary cameras without prior planning. In one of the photos, he appeared in the garden, leaning over the shed. The photo had been taken minutes before. Someone was watching him in real time. The sound of footsteps finally became unmistakable, not hurried, not furtive. Controlled steps, ascending the stairs with regularity. Jonathan didn't hide. He remained motionless, staring at the office door as the doorknob turned slowly. The figure that entered was not a stranger. It was Thomas Keller, the family's former administrator. A discreet man, always present during Jonathan's childhood, but almost invisible. He had aged but maintained his rigid posture and attentive gaze. He wore simple, clean clothes and carried a worn leather briefcase. "You're back," Thomas said, unsurprised. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He observed the man as one might re-evaluate an old memory in a new light. Thomas showed neither guilt nor hostility, only functionality. "My father knew I was coming," Jonathan said finally. Thomas nodded only once. It was inevitable. The conversation didn't go deep. There was no need. Thomas explained in short sentences that the house had never been abandoned, that Edward had left clear instructions, that certain processes needed to continue until they were properly concluded. Jonathan asked about the notes, the records, the observations. Thomas did not deny it. His father believed that human behavior could be refined, corrected, eliminated when necessary. Jonathan felt a cold weight in his stomach. It wasn't a surprise, it was confirmation. And me? He asked. What was I? Thomas opened the folder and revealed the most recent reports, assessments, reaction tests. Controlled exposure to isolation, fear, and constant surveillance. You were the final project. The conflict was no longer just about the house or the past. It became immediate, personal, and inescapable. Jonathan wasn't there to inherit something, but to complete or interrupt a system that remained active, awaiting his decision. Thomas Keller didn't move after the revelation. He wasn't waiting for approval or an emotional reaction. He simply observed Jonathan with the same clinical attention described in the reports. The conversation ended without a formal conclusion, as if both knew that the next step wouldn't come from words, but from actions. Jonathan left the office and walked down the hall unimpeded. Thomas didn't follow him. That wasn't permission. It was trust in how the system worked. The house, the records, the habits, everything was structured to guide him to certain points at the right time. One of the subplots began to unfold when Jonathan accessed the wing of the former staff dormitories on the lower ground floor, a space that was rarely mentioned during his childhood. There he found small rooms, too clean to have been abandoned, beds made, empty closets, except for forgotten objects, a broken clock, a pair of worn shoes, a book with pages torn out. In one of the rooms, Jonathan found a deep mark on the wall, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. This wasn't recorded in the financial records or technical notes. It was a human trace, imperfect, that stood out from the organization of the rest of the house. Time pressure began to mount when Jonathan realized that some previously accessible doors were now locked, not with new locks, but with the old internal mechanisms activated manually. The house was gradually closing in, restricting spaces, directing movement. The system was entering an active phase. Another layer was revealed when he investigated the basement, an area he had been forbidden access to as a child. The place didn't seem like a simple storage space. There were makeshift partitions, rudimentary soundproofing, and dates etched directly into the concrete. Jonathan recognized patterns similar to the symbols seen on the boxes in the West Wing. He wasn't dealing with just an isolated experiment. It had been replicated, adjusted, repeated. In one of the basement rooms, he found old tapes and more recent digital files. The names were missing, replaced by codes. However, by watching selected excerpts, Jonathan identified familiar behaviors. People reacting to constant surveillance, prolonged isolation, and subtle manipulation of their environment. There was no explicit violence. The horror lay in the normalization. The most disturbing subplot emerged when Jonathan found records involving his mother. Margaret hadn't been merely a passive accomplice. She appeared as a mediator, responsible for observing emotional reactions, recording silent breakdowns, and intervening only when external stability needed to be preserved. Her emotional absence wasn't weakness, it was a method. As Jonathan processed these discoveries, he realized the system reacted to his movements. Lights would turn on in specific areas, guiding him. Metallic sounds signaled the closing of access points behind him. The house imposed a sense of urgency, without announcing deadlines, creating a constant feeling of an invisible limit approaching. Thomas reappeared only once, in the central corridor, informing us that certain choices needed to be made before dawn. He didn't explain what they were. He didn't need to. The pendulum clock, still stopped at 3:17, had emitted a second dry click, something that had never happened before. Jonathan understood that the subplots didn't exist independently. The employees, the mother, the manager, the very architecture of the house, everything converged toward a single objective: to test how far someone could be molded without realizing it. And this time, there was no guarantee that the system would allow for a clean exit. The clock's second tick was not followed by silence. Minutes later, a continuous sound coursed through the house, a low, almost imperceptible noise, similar to an old generator starting up. Jonathan felt the vibration in the floor, even before identifying its source. The system had shifted. The lights in the main corridor went out in sequence, one by one, while others lit up in specific areas, creating a forced path. It wasn't an invitation, it was a guidance. Jonathan followed, not out of obedience, but out of calculation. I knew at that point that resisting predictable stimuli was part of the test. The unexpected would come from the conscious choice to move forward. The route led him back to the West Wing, but not to the archives. A door that had previously seemed only part of the wall opened automatically, revealing a narrow staircase descending even deeper than the basement. The air there was colder, denser, laden with old dampness. Jonathan descended slowly, counting the steps. 42. He always counted when he needed to keep his mind steady. At the bottom of the stairs he found a circular room. Unlike the rest of the house, this space didn't try to look normal. Walls covered in matte metal, mirrored glass panels, and a single table in the center with a chair on each side. On the table, a monitor was already switched on. The monitor displayed real-time images of the mansion. Every hallway, every room, every known blind spot had been eliminated down there. The entire house converged on that room. Jonathan understood at that moment that the mansion was not the experiment, it was merely the shell. The monitor changed the image. Edward Whitmore appeared on screen. It wasn't an old recording. The quality was too high, the framing too precise. Edward was sitting exactly as Jonathan was now, in the same space, wearing similar clothes. His gaze was direct, conscious. "If you're seeing this," the image said, "then the system has determined that you've reached the necessary point." Jonathan didn't react immediately. The shock wasn't emotional, it was logical. His father hadn't just foreseen his return, he'd foreseen that exact moment. Edward continued, explaining that his death had been a controlled event, not an end, but a final variable. The system needed to function without the Creator's presence to prove its autonomy. Thomas was not the successor. Margaret was not the guardian. Jonathan was the decisive element. A system is only complete when it can choose to continue or shut itself down, Edward stated in the recording. The monitor then displayed biometric data, heart rate, pupillary responses, stress levels. Jonathan recognized the patterns. They were his in real time. The house wasn't just watching him, it was evaluating every micro-decision from the moment he crossed the gate. The final revelation came when the image changed again, showing files classified as results. Names crossed out, codes terminated, all but one, his. Jonathan understood that the turning point wasn't a choice between fleeing or confronting. It was something deeper. The system was created to be inherited, not destroyed, to continue refining itself through someone who had known its flaws since childhood. A voice echoed through the room, not from the monitor but from the house's internal system. Confirmed. On the table, 2 buttons lit up. One would permanently terminate all processes, erasing records and shutting down the system. The other would activate the next phase, now under his direct supervision. Jonathan remained motionless. The final test wasn't about morality, it was about continuity. And at that moment, he realized something that changed everything. The house no longer needed to convince him. It had already shaped him enough to know that the decision would be far less obvious than it should have been. Jonathan didn't press any of the buttons. The system reacted to the lack of response with an almost imperceptible change in the environment. The vibration ceased, replaced by a deep silence, too heavy to be natural. The monitor remained on, displaying his biometric data in real time, as if evaluating not only what he would do, but how long it would take him to do it. Delay became a variable. Secondary lights switched on in specific points of the mansion, visible on the screens. Doors closed in strategic areas. The house adjusted the scenario, creating a state of containment. Jonathan understood that the choice would not be forced directly. The system preferred to drive through attrition. He rose from his chair and walked slowly around the circular room. The mirrored glass reflected his fragmented image, multiplied at different angles. This was not merely architecture, it was psychological stimulation, designed to reinforce self-awareness, constant vigilance. The first consequence came from Thomas Keller. His voice came through the loudspeakers, steady, without emotion. The system recorded prolonged indecision. This alters the protocol. Jonathan responded only with actions. He approached the side panel and watched new indicators appear. Sections of the house were being permanently isolated. Areas he hadn't yet explored were now inaccessible. The system was removing options, narrowing the path. Another consequence manifested itself in the displayed records. Files previously classified as closed reappeared as active. Some crossed-out names returned to the screen, now associated with new observation cycles. The system wasn't just punishing Jonathan, it was reopening processes that had been considered completed. The emotional reaction Jonathan felt wasn't immediate guilt, but responsibility. He was beginning to understand the perverse logic. Any delay affected others. The system had been designed to transform hesitation into collateral damage. Margaret appeared in an automated recording, triggered by Jonathan's increased stress levels. Unlike the others, this one didn't seem entirely scripted. She spoke calmly, explaining that Edward's biggest mistake had been believing that absolute control would eliminate human flaws. Jonathan's role, according to her, would be to correct that, not with empathy but with enhanced efficiency. The recording ended abruptly. The pendulum clock, somewhere above them, emitted a third dry click. Jonathan realized that the system had already registered his presence as permanent. It no longer mattered whether he pressed a button or not. The simple fact that he had understood the structure, that he had seen beyond the facade, made him an integral part of the process. The consequences accumulated in layers: progressive isolation, reactivation of cycles, silent transfer of authority. The system did not wait for explicit consent. It recognized competence through adaptation. Jonathan felt for the first time since his return something close to real fear. Not of the system, but of the clarity that was forming. The point of no return had been crossed without a visible gesture. He could still act, but it was no longer clear whether any action would actually be outside of what the house expected. Jonathan stepped away from the panel and took a deep breath, aware that his every move was still being observed. For the first time since entering the circular room, he decided to act against the expected pattern. Instead of returning to the buttons or confronting the system directly, he requested manual access to the raw data, something that, according to the displayed protocols, could only be done by the original creator. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second. This minimal delay was enough for Jonathan to confirm an old hypothesis. The house wasn't infallible. It was just extremely well trained. He began to analyze the data not as a victim or heir, but as an auditor. He identified redundant cycles, tests that were repeated with slight variations, automated decisions based on outdated assumptions. Edward had created something powerful, but closed in on itself. A system that did learn, but only within the limits imposed by a single mind. Jonathan began to interfere indirectly. He adjusted minimal parameters, almost insignificant at first glance: response times, tolerance for behavioral deviations, weight given to human unpredictability. He didn't turn anything off. He didn't confront. He simply shifted the axis. The reactions were swift. The house began to respond in a less rigid way. Lights took longer to turn on. Doors didn't close with the same precision. The system tried to recalibrate, but encountered unforeseen resistance, someone who knew its innermost rules and yet chose to act outside of them. Thomas Keller reappeared physically, descending the metal staircase into the circular room. His expression now showed something new, not confusion, but discomfort. "That's not part of the protocol," he stated. Jonathan didn't respond verbally. He continued adjusting the data, demonstrating through his actions that the system could be reconfigured without being destroyed. Overcoming the challenge didn't come from force or disruption, but from profound understanding. He wasn't trying to conquer the house. He was taking away its monopoly on decision-making. Personal growth manifested itself in practical choices. Jonathan revisited previously avoided areas, reopened isolated sectors, and allowed old records to be permanently archived. Each action reduced the centralization of control, diluting the power that previously resided in a single point. The pendulum clock made a different sound. Not a dry click, but an incomplete movement, as if it were trying to start working again and failing mid-process. The symbolic time of the house was beginning to become irregular. Jonathan understood that he didn't need to become Edward's successor to end the cycle, nor did he need to destroy everything. His overcoming consisted of accepting that the system only existed because someone had believed that absolute control was possible and necessary. By redefining boundaries, Jonathan made it clear that growth didn't come from repeating patterns, but from the ability to consciously interrupt them. The system was still active. The house was still watching. But for the first time, she was no longer dictating the course of decisions alone. Jonathan knew he couldn't just stay behind the scenes of the system. The house, though partially neutralized, continued to react to his decisions. Each adjustment made to the records caused subtle but noticeable changes. Doors that previously closed on their own now remained open longer. Lights that blinked in rigid patterns began to vary. Cameras in strategic sectors recorded incomplete angles, as if the surveillance itself were being challenged. He walked through the corridors with heightened awareness. The atmosphere seemed different, more human, and less mechanical. But there was no room for complacency. Every step could trigger unknown mechanisms. Every decision mattered. The climax was approaching, and Jonathan needed to be prepared to act decisively. In the main hall, he found Thomas watching the monitors, silent but alert. The administrator knew that any attempt at direct interference would have immediate consequences. Jonathan kept his distance, but faced him with determination. His posture was different from when he entered the mansion. No more fear, no more hesitation, but a presence that could not be manipulated so easily. As he progressed to the second floor, Jonathan began to analyze the patterns of the internal systems. He discovered alternative routes, temporal gaps between monitoring cycles, and sectors that lacked complete redundancy. The house was still powerful, but vulnerable to the strategy of someone who knew every detail of its structure. The pendulum clock, previously stopped at 3:17, began to spin erratically. Each movement reinforced the feeling of urgency. Jonathan realized that time was not merely symbolic, it was a constant pressure designed to induce error. He needed to remain calm and act with precision. Upon reaching the West Wing, Jonathan found more records left by his father. A set of sealed folders containing cryptographic codes, which Thomas did not interfere with. Jonathan realized they were final instructions specifically addressed to him. Each page contained logic puzzles, observation tests, and moral choices that would determine the system's continuation. He understood that the climax would not only be confronting the system, but integrating all the knowledge he had acquired, understanding Edward's mistakes, correcting excesses, and preparing for the final decision. It was a complex equation of action, reaction, and anticipation. Jonathan stopped in the middle of the hallway, took a deep breath, and observed the multitude of reflections in the mansion's mirrors. Each reflection represented a possibility, a different choice, a consequence. He couldn't back down. The next step would define not only his destiny, but that of the house itself and everything it contained. The climax was approaching. The tension was mounting, not because of immediate physical danger, but because of the invisible weight of the decisions. Jonathan felt for the first time that he had real control. Not because the house allowed it, but because he finally understood its rules and limitations. The corridor seemed to expand and contract as Jonathan moved forward. The system detected every step, every hesitation, every breath, but for the first time, he wouldn't let himself be manipulated. Every movement was calculated, conscious. He was ready to face the point of no return. Upon reaching the circular room in the basement, the center of the system, Jonathan found the buttons illuminated again. One would terminate all processes, erasing records and deactivating the house. The other would activate the next phase, placing him in command. The monitor displayed its own vital metrics, as if the decision were being evaluated in real time. But Jonathan didn't press on immediately. He observed the fragmented reflections in the surrounding glass panes. Each reflection was a possible version of himself. The obedient son, the heir, the victim, the controller. He realized that the climax wasn't just about the physical action, but about integrating everything he had learned, overcoming manipulation and making conscious decisions. Thomas Keller appeared behind him, silent, observing. His eyes showed an unprecedented tension. Jonathan could see that the manager, accustomed to controlling results, was now insecure. Jonathan opened the monitor's side panel, accessing the raw logs he had reworked in the previous days. Every redundant cycle, every manipulation test, every surveillance pattern, he quickly analyzed them and made the final adjustments. The system began to react slowly, recognizing its new logic. There was no longer absolute rigidity, only parameters that Jonathan could direct. Then he turned to the buttons. Instead of choosing between destroying or taking over, Jonathan did something no one expected. He pressed both simultaneously, triggering a hidden protocol in his father's final instructions. The room trembled slightly. The monitor flickered, then showed images of all sectors of the house stabilizing into a new pattern. Each area now had limited autonomy, supervised, but without absolute centralization. The system, designed to refine and control, now functioned with balance. Jonathan had not only survived the test, he had transformed the very logic of the mansion. Surveillance continued, but now there were human limits. The house no longer dominated, it merely coexisted. Thomas Keller swallowed hard, acknowledging the change. He knew the mansion would never be the same again, and that Edward Whitmore's legacy was no longer an inescapable burden, but a tool of conscious power, in the hands of someone who finally understood its purpose and its flaws. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the tension dissipate. The house remained imposing, but for the first time, it had become an ally, not a prison. He had confronted not only the physical structure, but the psychological system that had shaped his entire life. The climax ended not with destruction, but with reinvention. Jonathan Whitmore was no longer just a participant. He was the architect of a new balance, aware of the power, responsibility, and legacy he now carried. Whitmore Manor would never be the same again. The silence that once dominated every corridor now seemed to contain a different order, one that recognized limits, autonomy, and human choices. Jonathan walked through the halls, observing the doors that once closed automatically now open, the corridors illuminated with a less harsh light, the files reclassified into more balanced patterns. He returned to the West Wing, reviewing the final records. Every old name, Every observation cycle, every test was reviewed and reorganized. There was no total destruction. His father's legacy continued, but now under human and ethical parameters. Jonathan felt a strange peace, not the peace of one who wins, but the peace of one who understands and transforms. Thomas Keller remained nearby, silent. His posture, once rigid, now revealed restrained respect. Jonathan no longer needed his monitoring. The administrator understood that the patriarch's son had not only surpassed the limits of the house, but redefined its functioning without being controlled. The balance achieved was the result of understanding, not submission. In the hallways, Margaret Whitmore appeared on one of the automated recordings, observing from a distance. For the first time, her gaze conveyed something beyond the usual formality. Recognition. She knew that Jonathan had passed the final test not through strength or obedience, but through intelligence and the courage to act outside the patterns imposed by a system created to control. Jonathan climbed up to the main hall, touching the grandfather clock. The time remained fixed at 3:17, but its meaning had changed, no longer a symbol of absolute control, but a reminder of the power of choice and the capacity for transformation. The mansion, which had once symbolized fear and surveillance, now reflected balance and human potential. He stepped away from the central staircase, breathing deeply. The tension that had accompanied him since his arrival was beginning to dissipate. Jonathan had not only survived the system that shaped his childhood, he had become responsible for its evolution. The mansion was no longer a prison or a perpetual test. It was a learning structure, now guided by someone who understood the limits of humanity. As he walked through the corridors, Jonathan realized that despite the macabre atmosphere that had always surrounded the property, a new kind of power had emerged. The power of understanding, conscious action, and reinvention. He would no longer need to fear the Whitmore family legacy, for now he knew he could transform it, balancing the past with the future. Night wore on, but the house remained awake in a different way, not merely observing, but coexisting. Jonathan looked at the exterior facade, at the grey stone walls that had once inspired fear. Now they seemed protective, guarding not dark secrets, but the new order he had established. The cycle of control had been broken. The system persisted, but with limits. The Whitmore family legacy was secure, but in a way no one could have fully predicted. Jonathan finally understood that power without conscience would be destructive, but power coupled with understanding could redefine everything. Months later, Jonathan Whitmore walked through the mansion's gardens, now adorned with flowers and rebuilt paths. Silence still prevailed, but it carried a different feeling, of balanced vigilance, of order without oppression. He no longer needed to fear his father's legacy. He had learned to manage it with intelligence and responsibility. Thomas Keller remained nearby, observing discreetly, aware that his role had changed, no longer absolute guardian, but advisor to someone who understood the limits of power. Jonathan knew that the mansion still held secrets, but now they were tools for learning, not instruments of control. The Whitmore family story continued, but under new hands, more human and aware. If you were captivated by this macabre and surprising story of the Whitmore mansion, share your thoughts. Comment below. What would you do if you were in Jonathan's place? Could you confront a system that controls your every move, or would you find a way to turn the tables like he did? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more mystery, horror, and suspense stories. Turn on notifications to follow each new narrative and immerse yourself in worlds full of secrets that defy reality. Your participation helps create discussions and reflections on what power, legacy, and choice are, and also inspires future stories that may surprise you.